has witnessed a climate change-induced natural disaster almost every day in 2022. That's according to a new report by the Center for Science and Environment. India must act now, and it has to, because Prime Minister Narendra Modi has committed at the COP26 summit in Glasgow that India will reduce the level of carbon emissions to net zero by the year 2070. So what will it take, starting now, for India to meet its commitment? Those are the answers we are seeking on the Great Climate Change Challenge, a 6-month-long campaign on your screens, an action-oriented plan to combat climate change. The logical starting point is, what is India's strategy for managing climate change? And we're very lucky to have with us Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India and co-author of a report, Managing Climate Change, a Strategy for India. Mr. Ahluwalia has been a key figure in Indian economic policy and is currently a distinguished fellow with the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi. Mr. Ahluwalia, pleasure to have you here on NDTV. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
You know, I think straight up, the urgency, the need to absorb and understand that the time is now for India when it comes to tackling, devising a strategy, spreading the word, inspiring change agents. Why is now so important?
Well, it's not just the time is now for India, the time is now for the world. Because, you know, there's no question that climate change, if it's not managed or limited, is going to be very damaging for the world, and we're going to be one of the countries most seriously affected. Now, we cannot control climate change by anything we do, but we have to be part of an international effort, a coordinated effort where everybody does its bit. And you know, if we don't do our bit, that international agreement will get eroded. So climate change is important for the world. It's especially important for India because we will be badly affected. We need to do our bit, and the Prime Minister's commitment in Glasgow indicates what our bit is. That means going to net zero by 2070, and I think it's time we now worked out a practical strategy for implementing it.
So the truth of the matter is, if you've got a net zero target for 2070, you've got to be doing something right here and now. Mm-hmm. And what's that which is right here and now? Targets that we need to achieve in the next 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, I think a good way of looking at that is to break down our own emissions into the different sources. And about 50% of our emissions come from generation of electricity based on fossil fuels, mainly coal. You've got another 30% that comes from industry using fossil fuels. Then you've got about 16% or something like that from different types of transport, and then little bits from different sectors. Now, in all of these, the area where we clearly have available technology to make a switch to non-polluting energy is really in the power sector. See, it's very important to recognize that you can always cut emissions by not growing, not having GDP, etc., and being satisfied with what you've got. But that's not really the solution. We want to...
And it won't happen.
It won't happen. Not just for India, the world.
Yeah.
We basically want to be able to grow. We want to expand our GDP, which is necessary to expand income levels, but we want to do it without generating emissions. Now, fortunately, at least let's look at electricity. You cannot develop without more energy. And one way of using energy in a non-polluting way is to switch to electricity in the first place and make sure that the electricity is non-polluting. And the non-pollution of electricity comes from switching away from coal to renewable energy and a few other sources.
So, when it comes to electricity, we all read in the newspapers renewable energy, whether it's solar or it's wind, capacity being built up in India. So you get a sense of optimism that there's something happening. But I want you to take a step back from that and say, when we talk about decarbonizing the electricity sector, what does it really mean?
Well, it means exactly what you said in practical terms, which is to build up solar and wind and a couple of other things, and phase down coal, okay? Should we be optimistic? Well, it's one of those typical glasses half full situations. If you ask the question, are we ramping up our renewable energy capacity? The answer is we are. As a matter of fact, the growth of renewable energy in India is at a very high rate. Are we doing it as fast as we need to in order to go to net zero? The answer is no. Because, we had a target for renewables in 2022, which was about 175 gigawatts, and I think we've only got to about 100. And we need to get it to 450 by 2030. So the good news is something is happening, more than something. But the not so good news is that if your target is serious, if you want to reach where you said you'll reach, you need to do a lot more.
So it brings me to the structural issues. You have renewable energy being generated, but it's got to be distributed to end consumers, like everyone in the audience, like me, like you. So there's the distribution piece, and how difficult is it to sort of get the two together?
Well, it's not that you'll get solar energy separate. It'll be fed into the grid.
Into the grid, but it's got to come into the
whoever's
grid.
buying electricity today, some of it is coming from renewable. They don't know it. They're just paying for the electricity, okay? Now, question really is that what do we need to do to accelerate the pace? The cost is very critical. Now, the good news on cost is that if you just look at the price of electricity per kilowatt hour generated, solar electricity is already much cheaper than coal, okay? But the problem with solar and also wind is that it's intermittent. You don't get a steady supply during the year. So you've got a big peak when the sun is shining brightly, and then it drops off. Now, to use this electricity in the grid, you need a steady supply. Initially, you can offset that by just buying more from the coal supplies because they can ramp it up a little. But if increasingly the capacity becomes heavily RE, that is not going to work. And certainly by 2030, we will need to find ways in which we can balance the renewable electricity to make it a steady supply. How do you balance it? Well, the most obvious thing is you put in grid-scale battery storage. So you have larger capacity during the peak period, store the electricity, and release the electricity when the solar production is low. That adds cost. And the present situation is that if you add the cost of storage to the cost of solar electricity, the total cost is higher than it is for coal. So the economics of the switch become more difficult.
And they're not sitting well right now. But am I being optimistic when I say there could be innovations when it comes to storage?
Yes, look, in the solar side itself, there can be innovations because the efficiency of cells will increase. Remember, this is not something that we're just doing ourselves. This is what's going to solve the problem for the whole world. So the cumulative research capacity of the world will be discussing how do we improve the efficiency of solar cells. The lesson for us is that our supply system must be sufficiently flexible to allow such new technology to come in. And that raises another set of issues, okay? But the biggest improvement we can hope for is that the cost of battery storage may come down. Now, battery storage is already coming down for electric vehicles. But the batteries you need for electric vehicles are very different
from the ones you need for a grid.
Yeah. And that cost hasn't yet come down because the transition hasn't yet occurred. But for the world as a whole, one should assume it's going to happen. That's why we need to have access to the best technology. And over a longer run, we will be one of the largest, if you like, the largest markets for grid-scale batteries simply because of the size of the economy.
Indeed.
So it makes sense to attract people with the technology to come and produce it here.
So I'm going to dive straight into the next big area, which is manufacturing and industries. And I'm approaching this like an accountant, but there's a logic for it, Mr. Ahluwalia, because, Electricity, 50%. Now let's come to industries and manufacturing, which is a third of the carbon dioxide emissions. And if we've got a net zero emissions target for 2070, it makes sense to approach this like an accountant. So when it comes to industries and manufacturing, and, it begs to be underlined, in the private domain, not, in the government domain, what's the strategy, what's the policy framework, and what do we need to watch out for?
Well, the technology for industry kind of varies depending on which industry you have in mind. I mean, for example, where an industry is using coal for heating purposes, it could just switch to electricity, an electric arc furnace, etc. It's much more expensive, but it can be done. Sometimes it's using, for example, steel is using coke, which is not just for heating purposes, it's partly a chemical kind of thing. There, hydrogen can be used to achieve the same objective. That hydrogen is going to be good for emissions if it's green hydrogen. So you hear a lot about green hydrogen. And green hydrogen is essentially, you're using electrolysis to split up water into oxygen and hydrogen. And the electrolysis, the electricity that goes into that is green electricity, not coal-fired electricity. Because obviously, if you're using coal-based electricity, you're
it defeats the purpose.
Not having much of an impact on emissions. So green hydrogen is very important, and that's why many of our major companies have announced that they have programs to produce green hydrogen. It's actually quite expensive right now, maybe a little more than $5 per kg, and targets have been mentioned that we really want to bring it out to $1 per kg. Now, how do you do that? That depends on the technology of electrolysis, the cost of electrolyzers, and all kinds of other things. Okay, that's one lot. I mean, certainly in places like aluminium, where you need heat, the electric arc furnace is doing its bit. So, depending on the industry, in the case and petroleum, because petroleum refining, for example, uses hydrogen all the time. But the point is, at the moment, if it's using hydrogen which is fossil fuel based, that's not helping.
Yeah.
So you bring in green hydrogen to take care of that problem.
And currently, green hydrogen is expensive, but there seem to be assertions made by Indian industry of really bringing it down to competitive levels. So we will have to see.
Yeah. Well, all over the world. I mean, I think this is something we must realize that, in the technology for climate change, the whole world is involved in it. We should certainly find that space in this area where we can contribute efficiently. We should not, in my view, get locked into the belief that we must invent the technology which is to be used. That would be true for electric vehicles, that would be true for everything. I mean, basically, look, technology is a global good. You can buy it. What is your objective? If your objective is to become the world's most efficient producer of green equipment, that's one objective. If the objective is to achieve what the Prime Minister said, which is the net zero target, that's a different objective.
Yeah.
And for climate change, that's what matters.
Transport, 15%, or thereabouts, when it comes to contribution to carbon dioxide emissions. So in transport, there is railways, there are buses, there are two-wheelers, there are cars. I know we can't do anything about airlines and ships, so let's park them aside for a moment. But again, what could be the policy framework for moving ahead on that front?
Well, there are lots of things that can be done. I mean, for example, take railways. Railways for many years has been trying to electrify its track, and I was told that 100% of the track effectively will be electrified within a year or two. Okay? Now, electrifying the track is one thing, but to become net zero, what you have to do is stop using diesel engines. You can still have an electrified track on which you're using diesel engines. So the railways, I think, need to work out what is their plan for converting their diesel engines into electric engines. This is technically possible. They've recently opened a factory a few years ago in Bihar, where General Electric is producing diesel locomotives of very high quality. We should negotiate with General Electric to say, look, although we have promised that we will buy 1,000 diesel locomotives from you for the next 8 or 9 years, whatever is left of the 10-year period, we actually now want electric locomotives. So could you actually
work with
redesign?
us?
Now, to do that, there will be a cost. And it's interesting, that cost cannot be made into a competitive bid because you're stuck with a company with which you've got an agreement. So you have to negotiate with them. Now, in the negotiation, you can use persuasive power, some demonstration of what the cost is elsewhere, etc. But if we leave it unchanged, we will end up buying 1,000 diesel locomotives for the next 8 or 9 years. That doesn't make any sense.
So then that would, automatically be at cross purposes with the decarbonization plan for Indian Railways.
That should be part of our operational plan. I think railways can, in fact, achieve this transition as long as the diesel locomotive portion is fixed. Come to road transport for passengers. The smallest segment in terms of fossil fuels is 2- and 3-wheelers, okay? That is the most easy to electrify. We already have electric scooter production. But at the moment, only about 5%, I think, of the total sales are electric, maybe less than that. Now, look forward. If you want to go, the Europeans have said that after 2035, there will be no internal combustion engine car sold in Europe. This means that as of now, research on internal combustion engines in Europe will stop because they're all trying to electrify. So there's huge changes taking place there in technology. We should also announce, when is it going to be illegal to sell an internal combustion engine vehicle in India? Now, maybe 2035 is too early for us. So maybe we should say 2040. Now, if you say 2040, you're giving the Indian automotive industry something of the order of 17 years to plan to phase out all ICE vehicles. They will have a problem because they'll say, look, their plant, etc., has a longer life. So you do some negotiation, whatever it is, but that would be a very concrete plan. Other countries are doing it, we should do it also, okay? What that turnover point would be needs to be decided by the government in consultation with manufacturers.
But listening to you, Mr. Ahluwalia, what's coming through is you need a blueprint and you need lots of coordination, okay?
Absolutely.
And coordination in many different senses, center, state, center, different ministries at the central level. So reflect a little bit on the challenges right now for India. We've talked about what the targets are and what the next steps should be, but what could the challenges be, including investment?
Let me just give some examples. You're absolutely right. I mean, internationally, this is called, you have to adopt a whole of the economy approach. I mean, if we are going to go to net zero by 2070, we almost certainly have to go net zero for power by 2055. And if that is the case, we don't need to produce as much coal as we're doing.
So there should be a plan B for coal.
This whether you want to publicize it or do it quietly, because these things become regionally sensitive. I mean, coal is produced in
certain
one or two areas.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that if we do make the switch, total employment will increase because all the solar installations, etc., will generate employment. But that stuff will happen elsewhere in the country, not in the coal-bearing areas. So you need to have a clear understanding that this is being phased down. This is what we're going to do to generate employment here, maybe give skills, this, that, and the other, and then see employment rise somewhere else. That requires a lot of coordination among different ministries.
And it needs to be a socio-economically sensitive plan that comes up. Mr. Ahluwalia, there could be a hidden carbon tax, there could be an explicit carbon tax, there could be many different avatars of it, but there's got to be a price to decarbonizing India. What are your thoughts?
No, I feel that the most transparent way of paying that price is to have a carbon tax. It won't matter for petroleum because we already have very high prices on petroleum products. We will have to impose a tax on coal, and that will raise the price of coal, and everybody who uses coal will then pay that higher price. That would actually make renewable energy without subsidies much more attractive, and the switch to renewable energies would take place smoothly. In addition, it would raise a certain amount of money, And, for the transition, we do have to spend money, like helping people who may lose jobs and doing adaptation and other things. So the resources that would be realized in the next 20 or 30 years would be useful for that. Now, if you ask people, are you willing to accept a carbon tax? The chances are they'll say no. Okay? But what does that actually mean? What that means is, are you saying you don't want decarbonization? That's a consistent approach. I don't want to go to net zero, so I don't want to pay a carbon tax. But if you say, I want to go to net zero and I don't want to pay a carbon tax, what you're really saying is that the government must subsidize renewable energy. So that'll come out of the budget. If the budget is going to be balanced, that's going to require some raising of taxes.
So there's going to be a tax.
There has to be. That's what you call a hidden carbon tax. Okay. Now, I think that rather than have hidden taxes, let's persuade people that, look, if it's worth managing the climate, and it is, believe me, then we should live with a higher carbon price, which will get reflected in electricity prices. And, if you want to insulate the poor, that's always possible. Because many states say that for first so many 100 units, it's free, okay? Well, you just raise the money from the others in a very thin additional charge. There's been a lot of work done internationally on it. I won't go into that. But an important thing you have to remember is that the Europeans have just passed a legislation saying that in the year 2026, they will import duties on countries which do not have either the equivalent of an internal cap and trade system or an explicit carbon tax. Now, that means that if we don't have it, all our steel exports that go abroad will get a duty on them.
And there are many such examples like that.
And that raises issues because if you have a carbon tax, steel will be much more willing to go with green hydrogen because it's a little more expensive. Otherwise, they'll want a PLI or something or the other.
Sure.
I don't think the budget can afford so many subsidies. It already has too many.
Montek, Singh, Ahluwalia, thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. Much appreciated. The policy solutions and the measures, they'll come from governments. They'll come from scientific institutes. What we at NDTV want to do is highlight real-world solutions as well. People who are living with the consequences of climate change every day. We want to ask them, see, what are they doing? How are they adapting? What are they doing to help their communities? And so today we're urging you to join us on the Great Climate Change Challenge. It's now open, and we want to talk to, we want to highlight, we want to really spread the message and experiences of social entrepreneurs, tech innovators, NGOs, young scientists, students, everyone who has something to contribute to climate change. So tell us about yourself and the work that you're doing. Reach out through the Great Climate Change Challenge. We will take your experiences, your solutions, and your learnings to the world. We can promise you that. Thank you and goodbye till the next time we meet on the Great Climate Change Challenge.